Hey, aloha. Well, today I'm just going to tell you where we're going to be at in the Bible. We're going to be in Mark chapter 5. Mark chapter 5. We're going to be looking at the first 20 verses, and you can turn there if you want to, and be ready for it and follow along when I read it. But before we do that, I just wanted to mention a few things here. Last week, I talked about the most important job of the local church is carrying out the Great Commission. And of course, the Great Commission is just basically encouraging unbelievers to trust in Jesus. And it's also encouraging believers to grow in their Christian faith. And I said that encouraging unbelievers to trust in Jesus is what we oftentimes call evangelism. And I talked about how a core component in evangelism is being able to share the gospel message. And because this is so important, I wanted to briefly go back over some of this, and I feel like that I left out some important things regarding the part when you encourage someone to believe, or when you encourage someone to trust in Jesus. Last week, I gave you a short outline of the gospel. One would be there's a God who made us, or a God who made you. Two, we all have a sin problem. Three, only Jesus can fix your sin problem. And four, Jesus fixes the sin problem of everyone who trusts in him. And of course, you want to go into a little bit more detail than that if you're sharing the gospel with somebody, but that's just a basic framework to kind of follow a basic outline if you want to use that. And of course, as you go into more details, like how do I know what more to say? You can learn to do that the more that you learn about the biblical message. Of course, you learn more about the biblical message by reading the Bible, studying it on your own, but also by looking at the Bible together. So like whenever you come to a church worship service, the messages that are shared, or something like this in an online format, hopefully these are things that can help you to understand the Bible a little bit better. When you're part of small groups that have Christian discussions, those are things that you can certainly learn more about the Bible. And also things like reading books or reading articles from trusted Christian trusted Christian leaders, or listening to them. These are all ways you can learn more about the Bible. And when you share the gospel message with someone, you don't want to just have it be a monologue, you just talking with them. You want to get some feedback from that person that you're sharing with. You want to see if they understand it. So if they don't, you certainly want to do the best you can to explain it in a way that they can understand. I mean, you don't want to be talking about something and they're just kind of looking at you with a glossy stare, and then if you were to say, well, do you understand what that means? And they go, no. So you want to know that if they don't understand it, you want to be aware of that so that you can kind of shift gears and, retrace your steps a little bit and try to explain it in a way that they can understand it a little bit better. And another thing that you want to try to do when you're sharing with them, not just do they understand it, but do they believe it? How do they feel about this? Is this something they don't believe? Do they believe it? And if they don't believe it, you might say, there's a God who made you. What do you think about that? Do you believe that? And they might say, I'm not real sure about that. I'm just not convinced of that right now. If they don't believe part of the gospel message, or even any of it, you don't want to try to push it on them. You don't want to try to get into some kind of a big argument with them or something of that nature. So you want to get some feedback. What is it that they're thinking? Do they understand what you're talking about? Do they even believe it? Any of it, or all of it, or none of it? So you find that out by making it more of a dialogue and asking some questions as you go along. Now, if they seem to believe in the basics of the gospel message as you're going through it, but they haven't necessarily stepped out and trusted in Jesus, they haven't committed their life to him. Or maybe it could be something like they're having trouble believing that Jesus would spiritually save them, or that he would forgive them, maybe because of something they've done, or this is something I've done that's so bad, I just don't think he would ever forgive me, or I just don't believe that Jesus would love me that much, or I haven't done enough. I need to do more for Jesus before he'll save me, or something like that. I've had, I've talked to people, and when I've shared the gospel with them, I've had all those responses. And if something like that happens to you, I would just say to gently encourage them to trust in Jesus. That he saves and forgives everyone who trusts in him. The Bible teaches that. It doesn't matter what you've done. The worst thing that you could ever do is to go through your entire life and reject him, to reject his message, to reject his truths, to reject his promises, to reject his gift of himself. He is strong enough. He's powerful enough to save and forgive anyone, no matter what they've done. And he's loving enough. He loves you. He loves everybody enough to want to save them, regardless of who they are or what they've done. So those are some things to just kind of keep in mind if someone is kind of teetering and they just can't trust in Jesus. Those are some things that you can present to them. Now, let's say you get to the point where somebody says, I do believe in that message, and I do want to, well, let me kind of walk back. You might even ask the question, do you want to trust in Jesus? And I say, yeah, I do want to do that. Then, it's just encourage them to do it. You want to encourage them to take next steps. Now, one of the things that you'll often hear, whenever somebody's talking about the gospel and presenting the gospel to someone, and at the end you get to this point where they believe in it, but they haven't trusted in Jesus, but they want to. Many would say that you want to lead them through a sinner's prayer, and what a sinner's prayer is, you basically have this prayer where you say, "Dear God, I admit I'm a sinner, and I invite Jesus into my heart." It goes into more details with that, but it's almost like, repeat this prayer after me, pray this prayer. And they do. And at the end of it, someone will say, okay, well, now you're saved. So, I think it's fine to do a sinner's prayer with someone, to lead them through a sinner's prayer. In fact, I think it's great, to be able to do that. But I don't think that it's necessary to recite a specific prayer, so to speak, so I think we have to be really careful about that. What's most important is that they have faith in Jesus, that they trust in Jesus. Okay. And if they really trust in Jesus, they have invited him into their heart. So one of the things that, if you read through the Gospels and you read about Jesus, even in the book of Acts, I mean, when it comes down to someone, being saved or being forgiven of their sins, you don't really hear of anybody saying, okay, let's go through a sinner's prayer. Repeat this prayer after me. No, they say, trust in Jesus and step out in faith and follow him and obey him. Trust and obey Jesus. That is the main biblical message, having faith in Jesus. That is what's most important, not so much praying a prayer. Now, I would say that I think it's important that at some point, if they haven't done this already, they do want to pray. They do want to call out to God in their own words. I mean, that is all throughout the Bible. Call on the name of the Lord and he will save you. So there is a sense in which you want to encourage them to do that if they haven't already done it. And by calling out to God, you would confess the gospel. And I'll just say something. I'll just kind of say this on I don't have anything planned out here, but what does it mean to call on God? Well, you just might say, God, Father God, I recognize you are my great creator, and I've got a sin problem. you have expectations of how you want me to live, but God, I just cannot do it. It doesn't matter how much I try, I cannot live up to your expectations. I need you to rescue me. I need you to come down and help me. And I believe that you have sent Jesus to help me, to save me spiritually, to bring me forgiveness, that he's able to do that through his death. He was able to do that. He's resurrected. He's powerful enough to do that. Father, I trust that he will. I welcome Jesus into my heart, and I want him to give me direction in my life. I don't want my own sinful ways to give me direction anymore. I want Jesus to give me direction. And I welcome that. And I trust that Jesus will save me. You know, just to mean that. Say it in your own words. Or it could even be more simpler. It could be something like, God, I have a sin problem. I believe in you. I believe in your word in the Bible. I believe in Jesus. God, save me. Forgive me. And really mean that, you know, just put it in their own words, you know, just encourage them to do that. So I think that is important. And when somebody does that, when you see that they have invited or welcomed Jesus into their life like that, into their heart, you would want to encourage them to take next steps. And what is the next steps? Well, it's the next steps in the Great Commission. You know, if the first step would be encouraging someone to trust in Jesus, the next step is if you're encouraging unbelievers to trust in Jesus, the next step, now that they're a believer, is to encourage that believer to grow in their Christian faith, right? So here are the next steps that Billy Graham used to tell new believers, new Christian believers. And I even heard him say this when I was at he used to call his gatherings crusades in these big arenas or big stadiums. And at the end, he would call people to come up and make a commitment to Jesus. And the ones that did, this is what I remember him saying. He says, you know, you want to take some next steps. And the first next step in terms of growing in your Christian faith is to read and study the Bible. You know, this is how you know what who God is and who we are and what he expects of us as people. This is how you learn it. This is the roadmap, the guide that he's given us in terms of knowing what to do next and how to live and what he wants with our lives. So read and study the Bible. Second thing Billy Graham said was develop your prayer life with God. That is talking with God. And how do you do that? Well, one, you just got to do it. The more you pray, the more that you're going to develop your prayer life. And also, what do you pray? How do you know what to pray? Well, you pray according to the Bible. The Bible teaches you who God is. And so based upon who he is, you know, I'm going to say, wow, I recognize this is who you are, God, and I approve of it. I think it's great. I praise you that you are this kind of a God. I praise you that you're eternal. I praise you that you're all-knowing. I praise you that you're ultimately in control of everything. Praise you that you're all powerful. You're all wise. You're self-sufficient. You know, all these things, that you're patient and kind and loving and merciful. I praise you for these things. And that can be part of your prayer life. Another part of your prayer life is saying, God, help me. So God has laid out in the Bible who he wants us to be as people, our character, our you know, our motivations. He wants us to trust and follow his way. As we learn that in the Bible, that's our prayer. God, help me to be this person. Transform me, make me into this kind of person. You know, so that's how we develop our prayer life. So you develop your prayer life with God. A third thing that Billy Graham said, he said, share your Christian faith with others. That is, share the gospel. You know, and these are things that we've been talking about last week and up to this point today, and then really for the rest of the day is what we're going to be talking about. And then a fourth thing he mentioned was to commit to a local church that believes in the Bible, a Bible believing church. So that's so important, because God didn't just save us to be individuals, he saved us to be a people. And, you know, if according to God's design, it's so important to be part of a church, to be part of a church family and actively engage with your church family. Definitely on a weekly basis, but if not more. You know, there's three components we see that God has laid out in His design for us to be healthy followers of Christ, healthy believers, healthy Christians. And one is, you got to have God. That is the Holy Spirit's got to be in your soul. He's got to be in your heart, motivating you and moving you. A second thing, you got to have direction, and your direction comes from the Bible. So the Bible is a second key component. And the third thing is, you got to have God's people walking along beside of you. That is the church. To be committed to a church, you're committed to them, they're committed to you. You're committed to walk along beside of one another in order to help each other with this walk that we're in. Guys, we're all a bunch of misfits, aren't we? You know, we're not perfect. That's why we need Jesus. I was telling some of the folks this morning, I said, there's you guys have probably heard of a guy by the name of Zig Ziglar. He's passed away now, but he once told a story. A lot of times people look at church and say, well, I don't need the church. Let me just say, before I quote what Zig Ziglar said, people can say they don't need the church. I can be a Christian without the church. Well, that's true. You can be. But I would say, according to God's design, you can't be a healthy Christian. God has put that in place. We're to walk along beside one another and help one another. We're all misfits. We've got our own problems. We're to help one another in our walk. God wants it to be that way. Well, back to Zig Ziglar, one of the things that he said, I've come across people and they'll say, oh, yeah, you know what? I look at the people over here in this church, they're not all that good. These people over here who aren't in church, they're as good as they are. Well, you know what? That may be true, because we all have our problems. All people in churches have their problems. I have my problems. I'll admit it. I'm not perfect, not even close. And none of the other people in church are close to being perfect either. And hopefully they'll admit that. But, Zig Ziglar once said that there's this guy that looked at him and said, I'm not going to go to that church. They're just a bunch of hypocrites. Now, how many times have you heard that? I've heard it more than once. People say that. Zig Ziglar said, I didn't say this to him, but here's what I thought. This is what I wanted to say to him. I wanted to say, well, why don't we just come on down here to church and join us hypocrites? You'll fit right in, right? Because we all are, right? None of us are perfect. We need Jesus. We can't do this thing on our own. We trust in Him to make us who God wants us to be. That's the whole point. And so it's important to be part of a local church so we can help one another in our Christian faith, to grow in our Christian faith in a loving way, not in a mean-spirited way, but in a kind way, a loving way, a way in which we welcome that from one another. All right. And so we're to commit to a local church that believes in the Bible. And the first step of committing to a Bible-believing church is getting baptized into water. It's just a symbolic act to say, hey, this is what I believe what you believe. It's telling other Christian believers, I believe what you believe. It's what Jesus told us to do in the Bible. So if you're presenting the gospel to someone, and for whatever reason, they're just not ready to trust in Jesus right now, because that happens. I've run across plenty of people that's been the case with them at that moment. I would just say, guys, don't force it. Don't push it on them, but gently encourage them to do it sometime in the future. And encourage them to let you know about it when they do. I've done that before. In fact, there was a guy that came here to Eleele Baptist a few years ago. He was a tourist from the mainland, and he came here with someone. He didn't even want to come. He didn't even like going to church. He was, kind of fed up with churchy stuff and really didn't want to have too much to do with God. And so anyway, he came, and it just so happened, I thought it was really interesting. I happened to be speaking about a subject that I don't ever talk about. It's kind of an unusual subject. And this just so happened to be a subject he was very interested in. And so it really piqued his interest. And after everything was over, and I don't believe that there's any coincidence that God's not over. But anyway, at the end, he talked with me. I actually had him come up and talk with me in the house. And eventually, a couple of days later, we talked about it some more. And I was able to present the full gospel to him. And he sat there, he listened, and and he agreed with everything. And he said, I can agree with everything except for this one thing. I just can't believe that Jesus would love me enough to go to that extent. And so what I did, I said, well, he does love you. That's just it. He is God. And the Bible says he does love you. And if you trust him, he will forgive you and save you and let you live in peace with him for eternity. He kind of let that sink in, and we kind of parted ways. Well, eventually we talked on the phone a couple of weeks later, and he said, you know what? I believe that. I asked him to. I said, I encouraged him to, you don't trust in Jesus now, but let me encourage you to do it in the future sometime. And if you do, let me know about it. And we were on the phone a couple of weeks later, and he told me, saying, you know what, Jesus, I trust in him. You know, I, I believe in God. I believe in following Jesus. And I was so happy to hear that. And then about a month or two later, he died. And so I was so glad that that he did that. So you can encourage people if they're not ready at that moment to trust in Jesus later, and hopefully they will. But sometimes they won't. I remember when I used to work with hospice as a chaplain, I had a patient one time that same thing with him. I mean, we talked, and he welcomed this. He wanted me to talk with him about it. I bet I talked with him for 2 or 3 hours, just going over the gospel, and he was just right there. He said, I just can't accept it. I just can't. I believe in all the components, but I just can't, just give my life over to Jesus. I can't. I don't remember exactly what the hang up was, but there was something he just couldn't commit his life to Jesus. And it was just maybe a couple of weeks later he died. And I don't think that he died knowing the Lord. I mean, I think it's such a sad thing. So you're going to run into different responses whenever you present the gospel. There was a guy I talked about this morning. He was an old pastor by the name of Ichabod Spencer. Back in the early 1800s, he lived up in New England, I think in Connecticut. But anyway, one of the things he was really big on was personal evangelism, and he talked with so many different people, and he would write down his stories. I don't think he would write their names down necessarily, but he'd write about the events and the circumstances and how the conversations went. It was really interesting. So anyway, he had situations like this too. And one of the interesting things about Ichabod Spencer that is a little different from typical people who present the gospel. A lot of times people present the gospel, and if someone seems open to it, then they try to lead them in a sinner's prayer. And what Ichabod Spencer would do, he would get to this point, he would say, you know what, I just want to encourage you to trust in Jesus, call out to him in prayer, and confess God to who he is, and you need his help as a sinner, and that you believe in Jesus and you want Jesus to bring you forgiveness. Put it in your own words, but I'm leaving. And he would leave. He said, I'll come back and check up on you later. But he'd leave them by themselves. He wanted them to cry out to God. He didn't want to, for them to just blindly repeat a prayer. Sometimes when that happens, a person can trust in what they've done. They can trust in saying that prayer, reciting that prayer to save them. Only Jesus saves them. So just call out to him. So he would leave. I remember there was this one particular incident when he, I think there was somebody that may have been in their sick bed, that may have been dying, and they were in such anguish. And I don't mean physical anguish. I mean like emotional and mental anguish. They knew they were going to die soon, or believed that they were going to die soon. They didn't know what was going to happen to them. They were just in torment of what was going to happen to them after death. And Ichabod Spencer came in and presented the gospel and encouraged them to call out to God. He says, I want you to do that, but I'm leaving. I'll come back later and check on you. He came back later, and they were completely different. They're in total peace and just relaxed. And so what happened? Well, I did what you said. And He said, oh, that's great. But Ichabod Spencer had other stories. I know there was one in particular where similar type of thing happened, and he came back and they hadn't called out to God. And they were still in that pretty, well, they were in a, they were still very, very distressed, and they died that way. It was just a really sad thing. So you're going to experience different things whenever you share the gospel with someone. Now, as Christian believers, God calls for each of us to encourage unbelievers to trust in Jesus. And the first step to be able to know how to share the gospel message and to see how they respond to it, and to know how to respond to their responses. You know, the first step is just being able to know those basics. Okay, you want to be able to know how to share the gospel message. Okay, and the key to that is these things that we've been talking about, to be prepared for it. But you want to be able to see how they respond to the gospel. You want to be able to see, you want to be able to know how to respond to their responses, which we've just been talking about. And when I say all this, it can seem a little bit intimidating at first. It may sound like a lot to remember, but I just want to encourage you, you can do it. Okay. It's important to think about it often. You know, what is it that you would say exactly? What are those 4 gospel points? Or you might think of another way to word it, but what is a framework that you can use? This is how I would present the gospel. What if they responded this way? This is what I would say. What if they responded that way? Okay, here's how I would handle that. So it's really important you think about what you would say. And also, it's important to do it. Just like anything else, the more you do something, the better you're going to get at it, the more comfortable you're going to get at it. It doesn't matter what it is. Here's a computer in front of me. You know, for some people, computers are intimidating. Well, they're always going to be intimidating until you start working with one. And the more you use one and work with it, the easier it's going to get, and the more comfortable you're going to get with it. But here's another question I want to bring up. How do you get to the point of having these spiritual conversations with someone? That is, conversations which for a lot of people are personal and private, right? These spiritual conversations are just not something that people tend to talk about. Of course, you don't want to force these conversations on people, because that might make the situation even worse. So over the next several weeks, we're going to be talking about how to get to the point where you can have these spiritual conversations with somebody, and for it not to seem forced or unnatural, to the point where someone would welcome these conversations with you. And we're going to look at how you don't have to do all this by yourself. You can do it as a group with your local church. And really, that's what you should do. You should do it and engage in these types of things as a group in your local church. Now, before we close today, I want to talk about sharing your testimony. That is, sharing your Christian story. Sharing one's testimony is it's a very popular thing to do. It's something you'll hear about often in churches, and it's really a good thing to do. We want to share our testimony. There's an old saying in business I've shared with you guys before in the past: facts tell, but stories sell. Right? I think there's a lot of truth to that. You know, somebody might say facts about the gospel might tell someone about Jesus, but it's the stories, it's what Jesus has done in someone's life. That's what's going to encourage somebody to want Jesus to help them too, right? So I think that there's definitely some truth in that, at least to some level. And what I wanted to do, I want to read you an example of this in Mark chapter 5. So we finally got to our passage here, and then I'll say a couple of things, a few things before we close. But Mark chapter 5, starting in verse 1, we're going to read down to verse 20. And so it says here, they came, and they, here's Jesus and his disciples. So Jesus and his disciples came to the other side of the sea. That would be the Sea of Galilee. to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain, for he had often been bound with shackles and chains. But he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, don't torment me." For he was saying to him, Jesus had been saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now, a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs, let us enter them." And so he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs and the herd, numbering about 2,000. And they rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. And that was a lot of pigs. Verse 14, the herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country. And people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, why do they want him to go? This seems like a good thing that happened. Well, it depends on who you are. What if you own those 2,000 pigs? That was a big part of your wealth. That was your livestock. They're probably worth a lot of money, right? So other people who had pigs or some other sort of wealth, they may have been thinking, I hope this doesn't happen to my stuff. I hope this guy gets out of here. So that's probably what was going on. Anyway, they wanted him to leave. Verse 18, it says, as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with them, or with him. This is really the part where I'm really wanting to get to this morning. You know, Jesus has helped this guy, right? He's turned his life around, and he wants to go with Jesus. There's nothing for him here. He doesn't want to stay here. He wants to go with Jesus and be with him. But look at what happens next in verse 19. It says, and he here being Jesus, and Jesus did not permit him, but said to him, go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. In other words, go back to your home country, your hometown, and share your testimony. Share your story, your Christian story, what Jesus has done for you. So verse 20, that's what he did. And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And everyone marveled. So this man told his testimony to people. It was his story of what Jesus had done in his life. And it was a good thing. It was a great thing. And so it's good for us to tell others about our testimony too. It's good to tell about the positive difference Jesus has made in our lives. And it just really puts a personal touch to sharing our Christian faith. And that's important. And so as we move towards closing today, I want to give you 5 tips for sharing your testimony. All right, 5 tips for sharing your testimony. And the first one is, think of a short summary of your life before and after committing your life to Jesus. Think of a short summary of your life before and after committing your life to Jesus. So what was your life like before you committed to Jesus? Think about that. What was your life like after? And what has been the difference? What's been the positive difference? between Jesus coming into your life and before he was there. Now, if you've given this a little bit of thought ahead of time, it's going to be easier for you to share it when the opportunity comes up. You're not going to have to be kind of thinking, well, how do I word this? If you've been thinking about it, you can just share it, right on a whim. And by the way, whenever I said think of a short summary, don't feel like it has to be something that's real long. Don't feel like you have to spend excessive amounts of time going into the details of the bad things that you did before. One of the things you don't ever want to do, you don't want to seem like you're glamorizing those things. You really just want to highlight the negative things that used to be, but how Jesus helped to move you on from those things, right? Now, you can go into more details about it, depending on the situation or depending on who you're talking to. Maybe it's something that they had a similar, or they're going through a similar experience right now that you used to go through. So it just kind of depends. But think of a short summary of your life before and after committing your life to Jesus. Here's a second tip for sharing your testimony. Don't think that your testimony has to be exactly like someone else's. Don't think that your testimony has to be exactly like someone else's. I once met a guy who told about this huge conversion experience he had. I mean, it was like, he had done so many bad things in the past, and when God called him, the way he told it, to trust in Jesus, he remembers, exactly when that happened and all the things that happened, and it was just this wonderful experience, and his life was changed so much afterwards, and I think that's awesome. But he felt like that if someone hadn't had the exact same kind of conversion story that he had, then they weren't really saved spiritually. And that's just not true. We are all different people. We all have different paths in life. We all have different experiences in life. Your experience coming to know the Lord is not going to be exactly the same as somebody else's. One of the things, I didn't say this morning, but one of the things I have said to people is there's only one way to God, and that's through Jesus. But there's many ways to Jesus. God uses different things, different circumstances in our lives to draw us to Jesus, and not exactly the same. So, your past is not going to be exactly the same as somebody else. Your conversion experience is not going to be exactly the same as someone else. The extent to how emotional your conversion experience is not going to be exactly the same. For some people, we're all going to experience some level of emotion, I think, whenever we're converted, when we realize just what Jesus has done for us. There's going to be something emotional about that. For some people, though, it's going to be, the emotional part of it's going to be, way up there. I mean, it's going to be very, very emotional. For others, it's not going to be quite that emotional. That doesn't mean that their conversion wasn't authentic. It's just going to be a little bit different. Also, remembering the details. Some people would say, when you're saved and when you're forgiven, you should remember every detail of when it happened. You should remember the exact day, the exact hour, maybe the exact minute that it happened, that you were converted. And I just don't agree with that. What's important is not so much knowing when you were saved. What's important is knowing that you are saved right now, to be able to recognize that. And it's almost, think about this example. This is a silly example. Let's say somebody were to ask you, is the sun up right now? You say, yeah, absolutely, the sun's up. And they said, well, did you see it come up this morning? Did you see it come up over the horizon? And you were to say, well, no, I was actually doing something else. I missed it, or I wasn't up yet. And it was already up when I got up. And they might say to you, well, then you can't be for certain that the sun's up. But you can go back to them and say, yeah, I can. I know the sun's up. I didn't see it come up from over the horizon in the morning, the sunrise, but I know it's up because I can look up in the sky and I can see it right now. Right. And that's really the way our conversion is. We might remember the exact details of exactly when it happened, but we might not know exactly when it happened. What's most important is that you know it right now. It's being able to say, you know what, right now I know that I believe in Jesus. I believe in the gospel. I believe that he is who he says he is. I trust in his promises. I trust him enough to want to do everything he wants me to do. I want to obey him. I don't do it perfectly. I don't even get close for that matter, but I want to. And I can see evidence in my life where there's a consistency that I am growing closer to Jesus, and I'm obeying him because I trust him. That's knowing that you have faith in your life. That's much more important than knowing exactly the day and hour that it happened. So we don't want to get confused on these things. So again, don't think that your testimony has to be exactly like someone else's. Here's a third tip for sharing your testimony. Don't think that your testimony only has to be about your conversion experience. Don't think that your testimony only has to be about your conversion experience. Your conversion experience is not the only change that Jesus makes in your life. Okay? After you're spiritually saved, you still have sin in this life after this age. And Jesus still has to make changes in your life throughout your Christian growth. Now, you may have been a Christian for over 30 years, but maybe God really brought you through something, some sort of maturing moments over the past 5 years. Now, for me personally, I was very young at conversion. I wasn't quite 6 years old yet. Somebody might say, well, how do you even remember? How do you even know? How can you even be sure you even knew what you were doing back then? Well, for me personally, I was very aware of things when I was young. I can remember specific things in my life when I was still 2 years old, maybe the latter part of my that 2-year-old year. But I remember things, and so for me personally, my main testimony is not so much the difference before and after conversion, okay, but the difference that Jesus has made in my life throughout my Christian growth. I just don't have a real, if somebody has this strong before and after view of themselves or testimony of themselves before conversion, after conversion, I did all these bad things, and then after conversion, this happened. I don't really have that. I mean, when I was 5 years old, I can't. I mean, I can say, oh, yeah, I said some mean things to this other little kid, or I lied to him. I can say that, but really, the big changes that have come about in my life personally is, even after I was growing up, especially when I got in my late teens and early 20s, there were things in my life I just really got off track, and I was doing things I shouldn't have been doing, but God he didn't give up on me. He was still working on my life and molding me, and he helped me to kind of move past some of those things. I'm certainly not perfect with it now, but there's some things I don't quite do that I used to do at that stage of my life. So I talk about that. He's made a big difference in my life. So anyway, that's what I do. That's how my testimony is. So don't think that your testimony has to only be about your conversion experience. Here's a fourth tip for sharing your testimony, and that is, let your life be a reflection of your testimony. Let your life be a reflection of your testimony. There's hardly nothing worse than you telling someone what God has done for you, how he's helped you in a certain area of your life, but your lifestyle says the opposite. That'll make your testimony nearly worthless. Don't make your testimony try to sound better than it actually is, okay? And now it's true that God is going to make us completely perfect and sinless in the eternal age, but right now we are still a work in progress. We still struggle with things. So tell that in your testimony. Let them know, hey, I still struggle with a lot of things, but also tell about the real progress that you've seen so far, the differences you've seen in your life up to this point that Jesus has helped you with. Let your life be a reflection of your testimony. And then finally, here's a fifth tip for sharing your testimony. And that is, don't let your testimony be more important than the gospel message. Don't let your testimony be more important than the gospel message. Your testimony is really, really important, but it's not that important. Now, for some people, if they were to hear that, they would be shocked. What is he saying? It's not that important when compared with the gospel message. My seminary professor in personal evangelism once said, when you share your testimony, don't spend too much time on it. What he said was, you want to try to get to the gospel message as soon as possible. Some people can go on and on and on and on with their testimony. You don't want to do that. Sure, you want to tell about what Jesus has done for you. You want to make it personal in that way. But also, as we saw, in our passage today, it's a biblical example to share your testimony, right? This guy that was demon possessed, he did it. Jesus commanded him to do it even. But you only want to share it as a tool for transitioning into the gospel message. When you share your testimony, there seems to be more of an emphasis on you and on your life. But when you share the gospel message, there's more of an emphasis on Jesus. And that's where you want to be. That's where you want to get to ultimately. So sharing your faith is sharing your testimony. It's sharing the gospel message. It's something you want to do. It's something you want to work at getting better at. God tells us to do this. And so I would just leave you with this question. How are you doing with sharing your faith and encouraging others to trust in Jesus?